How's everybody doing? I'm ready to go if everybody else is.
Good. Well, thank you. Welcome back, Andrew, and everybody else. So turn it back to you, and we'll look forward to your discussion of storage. I just might add that there's a couple of questions that have come up, and I think we'll just push those to the end of the presentation. All right?
Sounds good. Okay, so obviously, you know, there's a lot of complexities and challenges that we've just looked at, and storage seems to be a silver bullet. And let's talk about some options. So what I want to talk through first is you know, where does storage fit? And what I've shown here is a diagram that's a little more detailed than that simple supply-demand picture. And it's flipped around. So this time on the left-hand side, I have my demand, because demand drives everything we build. That's the way to think about it. And between the demand and the, I can't even see my, there we go. No, that's not it. I want a pointer. So between my demand and supply, I've now pulled out sort of three connections or three pieces that go in between: service technologies, energy currencies, and transformer technologies. Okay, and we could talk a lot about this architecture. This is basically a model to help us understand the components that go into this matching of supply and demand. And you know, you could think about transformer technologies being things like you know, primary energy supply through the oil infrastructure, gas infrastructure, and what do we create with that? We create these currencies like commercial grade natural gas, diesel, jet fuel, electricity, right? These are manufactured energy carriers. That's the way to think about them. These are things that exist in a certain form that we don't find naturally in the environment. And you can kind of argue a little bit about some of them, like natural gas, but there's generally a cleanup required, some sort of processing required between what we pull out of our environment or out of the ground versus what enters the commercial pool of energy currencies. Another one that fits in here would be hydrogen. So you can imagine some technologies at this end tapping into some energy supply and producing hydrogen. Hydrogen would be just like electricity or gasoline or diesel. It's a form of conveying useful energy. And now on the left side, as we get closer to demand, we can talk about specific technologies to serve what we want. So if it's heat, you can obviously think about many different technologies that would go here, and those different technologies would rely on different currencies in the pool. So storage, right? What about storage and where does it show up? Well, storage has always been part of the system. And I don't think you know how it is. When you get familiar with something, you don't see it anymore. At least that's how I am. I don't see all the renovations in my house that I've not finished because I just don't even notice it anymore. So same thing with storage. We can think about storage as a way to accumulate a stock of something, right? It could be energy, it could be material, it can be money. And we've been using storage we built our system of storage. It's just that it's been provided to us in some form. So before we went into the fossil fuel era and we relied on biomass, biomass was intrinsically stored in its form. We could harvest that biomass and put it away for when we wanted it. Food, same thing. You know, we farm in the summer, we put the food away so that it's there for us in the winter when we don't have that productive capacity. And some examples of storage in this picture, well, our hydroelectric system would use a reservoir to store water, and we run that water through that technology, which would be the generation unit in the dam, to make the electricity. And that would go down the pipe and maybe get your house, and what's the next storage it might encounter? It might be your hot water tank, right? So we have a conversion of electricity into hot water, which is in a stored tank, so we can use that when we want, and it also has some benefits in terms of you know, the amount of capacity we need. What's different now, what we're really talking about is in the middle. It's about adding some technology that is really, instead of these two, I've got the two I've talked about, the forms are changing. It's water to electricity, right? And this one, it's electricity to hot water. What we are talking about is adding some storage, and this could be moving around in different locations, but the idea being that we really want to go from one thing back to the same thing almost. We want to take electricity, store it, and recover it as electricity. And this allows us to do a lot of things. Obviously, it helps with this temporal problem, the mismatch between supply and demand and time. It can also help with deferring how much we need to build in terms of transmission capacity. That's the hot water tank analogy. Instead of building a heater in my hot water tank that can hit the peak demand when my kids are in, or my teenager girls are showering and stuff, my hot water tank's accumulated that so that I've got that supply ready, and it means I don't have to have a 30 kilowatt heater. I can get away with a 5 or something like that, or lower. Same idea with electricity storage. It allows us to defer or reduce the amount of actual wire capacity or other generation infrastructure and transmission infrastructure. Okay, so flexibility was the term I brought up to help describe this challenge, and there's all sorts of different ways to help manage flexibility. But the one obviously we want to drill down to is to talk about storage and grid storage primarily. So storage for vehicles is, I'll touch on it a little bit, but it's not the primary focus. We're really going to talk about various ways that we can store electricity for grid services. And what this figure on the left is showing is kind of a breakdown of the types of service we want and in the electricity system based upon the power requirements, the storage time. Those are really the two primary characteristics we would need to define storage. How much energy, how fast do you want to charge and discharge? And there's other parameters we'll come to eventually, but that lays out this map of the different regions in which the electricity system is trying to manage reliability and control. Sub-second all the way up to seasonality and annual variations. So you can see this really short time frame stuff is in the power quality realm. We get up into longer stuff and we get into transmission and distribution deferral. And then there's a big green bubble in here that covers basically everything, and it says renewable energy management. If you look to the right, I'm sorry about figure quality here, it's a similar axis layout. Excuse me. And what's laid over top are various technologies that might be used to serve those different grid demands. And the colors represent hydrogen-related mechanical storage. You can think flywheels, electrochemical storage, electrical, maybe supercapacitors, and thermal storage as well. So there's a variety of physical mechanisms we can use to store energy. And the one that's getting the most interest these days is really becoming transformative is the electrochemical. Yeah, but let's quickly talk through some of the...
Andrew, could I just interrupt for a second? It's John here. It seems that the sound, the audio gets a little staticky from time to time. And I'm wondering if it's anything that, on your end, or if it's just life. I don't know. I'll just draw it to your attention. But
okay. Yeah, no, I haven't, of course, I'm hearing myself perfectly. So.
No, it's difficult to know what to do. So thank you, but carry on.
So I want to quickly talk about some of these technologies. Some of them are fairly obvious and are deployed right now. And pumped hydro is probably the first ones to talk about, since it's pretty simple and it works. And we've got in our region, the thing that's interesting about pumped hydro is it's fairly simple, it works, but you do need to have the geography to make it work. And not a lot of places have that. We certainly do. And where do we have the problem in BC is we have a lot of generation very, very far from where the major load center is, being Vancouver and Vancouver Island. But if you look at Vancouver, there's certainly geography that appears to be suitable for pumped hydro. And if you had a large pumped hydro facility near Vancouver, it would say that, okay, that means I can actually reduce the amount I might invest in transmission infrastructure because I can better utilize it. Anyway, there's a couple of basic types where you have two reservoirs, an upper and a lower, and you can move water back and forth and store it in the upper and make the electricity. And then there's this open loop system, which is an upper reservoir, and then you feed into a river system or something like that. And their efficiencies are pretty good, and but it's like any other large capital thing. There's a lot of investment to build these things, and there's a lot of footprint associated with them in terms of landscape, and there's also the geographic constraints. There's quite a bit though that exists. Again, in the U.S., you can see they built a lot of pumped hydro back in the 70s. So this is what this figure is showing, is essentially built capacity as a function of year. It died off after the 70s and 80s growth, and electricity demand was going crazy. And you get a rough sense of the storage associated with these pumped hydro facilities, the actual energy, and then the power rating. These are two important pieces. What does it actually look like? Well, this is a bit of a fuzzy picture of a pumped hydro facility in Germany. And this is where you've got a lower pond and an upper pond, and back and forth it goes. And this particular, now to show you the storage scale of that pumped hydro facility, we're going to lay it on actual data from Northern Germany wind farm production. This is from 2008. And what we see here, essentially, like 2 weeks at a time, and you see vertical axis is wind farm production in Northern Germany. It's a big scale, right? We're going from 0 up to almost 8 gigawatts, and the area under the curve is the energy. You can see, there's some rapid movements from near peak back down to 0 over some pretty short time frames. So storage suggests I can maybe take this excess and store it up, and then use it when I have efficiency. So that pumped hydro storage plant picture, the footprint you saw there, and this is a better photo of the upper reservoir. The energy and power rating on that is roughly this blue bar. Okay, so what is that meant to say? Well, it's meant to give you a sense of the footprint and the scale that might be required to have a really significant impact on this profile. If I wanted to level this profile, and that's probably not something you want to do, but if you imagine you want to level it, that means store and dump. You're talking about a pretty big footprint if you're going to do pumped hydro. What else might you do? And another form of storage that is used is to use what's called compressed air energy storage. And on this one, we have to be a bit careful, because the typical compressed air energy storage is not really a true storage technology. It's a hybrid. It burns natural gas. It's probably better to call this a very high efficiency gas plant. But it does use a storage mode to do that, and the diagram shows how it might work. You have some excess electricity or low-cost electricity that you would use to drive compressors. You fill up your storage reservoir, typically underground, and then when you want to actually produce power, you extract that. And what this has done is it's just reduced the amount of compression you normally have to put into a power plant, and you get a much more efficient plant. So this heat rate is an indication of how good it is. So a heat rate of 3,800, if this is BTUs per kilowatt hour or something like that, that's probably half of what a typical gas plant might be. And the nice thing about them, the footprint can be pretty small because it's an underground storage reservoir, so you can just have a hole outside the site of a mine, and they're fairly responsive. They can act pretty fast. What else can you do? Well, you can make hydrogen, right? We can make hydrogen using excess electricity through electrolysis. And you can do a lot with hydrogen. You can feed it directly into vehicles. You may feed it into the gas grid. You can also take hydrogen and make methane. This is called methanation. And this is another way to do storage. And there's losses that go into doing this. There's losses in terms of the conversion process for electrolysis. There's losses in making methane with hydrogen and CO2. But this is, again, a system problem to try and understand its value. There is obviously cost, an energy cost, and a capital to build this stuff, but it produces a currency that we have a built infrastructure to support. So the somewhat of a value proposition here is, wow, maybe we're going to pay for this, and the efficiency is not going to be great, but the direction we're going is that electricity is getting cheaper, so I don't care as much about efficiency, and there's a lot of infrastructure out there that delivers energy using gas, and to make use of it, repurpose it, that costs money too. So if I can actually put in a molecule that looks no different, then perhaps there's the real value to this. This is early days, so this is getting looked at in Germany mostly, but it's an interesting proposition. And one of the reasons for it is both methane and, methane, I'm not saying natural gas, I'm saying methane, because it could be made renewably. And hydrogen, made renewably or cleanly, can store a tremendous amount of energy. And again, using underground formations like a compressed air energy storage system, and this is supposed to be a cutaway to kind of give you a sense of what this looks like, is basically a vertical shafts. And in certain regions, you can make these storage volumes fairly easily. You drill a hole down into these formations where you have essentially salt that can be dissolved by pumping water through, and you can create very large caverns which are very gas tight. And this is done now for natural gas storage. A lot of this is in the US, so this isn't new technology. We know how to do it right now. What is it? And there's also the use of depleted oil and gas fields, so that's an interesting one when we talk about BC and Alberta. And what does this mean if we do it? Well, a representative storage of making hydrogen, putting it into some salt caverns that are stored, and these salt caverns are volume-wise, two of them together would be about equivalent to the compressed air energy storage system that you'd find in Germany now. I'm just trying to give you a rough idea what this could mean, and it's the same profile with 2 gigawatt rated power, and these volumes of storage at typical storage pressure. This is the quantity of energy you could store. So this is the beauty around any chemical energy carrier, is the high density storage that goes with it, unlike physical forms such as kinetic energy, flywheels, or potential energy, pumped hydro. And I'll show you this in a second, comparing a lot of different modes, but this is one of the real attractive things about chemical currencies. And you can get more elaborate. So this is a diagram I stole from Audi. I think it's Audi. Anyway, car company, which was saying, look, we're going to keep building some pretty awesome cars that are still going to use internal combustion engines, but we're going to do it so it's sustainable. And to do that means a combination of electrolysis to make hydrogen, capturing CO2, making a synthetic hydrocarbon from it, and this time a liquid, which would go directly into existing infrastructure one more time. So, you know, I'm trying to guess when I grabbed, oh, okay, there you go, 450, and this was, so in 5 years, there's been so much change. I'm not sure, I bet you Audi doesn't have this photo or this image up on their website anymore. It just might not look as compelling.
Andrew,
what else can we do?
John,
well,
it's John again, Andrew. It's John again. I don't know if there's a way of checking your microphone, but is it possible that something could be rubbing against it? Because we're getting a little bit of static from time to time. It's not overwhelming, but it's a little disrupting.
Let me just look at my wires here. It all looks normal.
Yeah, it seems to come and go. However, there's nothing we can do about it, I don't think. So we'll just carry on.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Fine.
So, you know, thinking about footprints, thinking about the form of storage, thinking about densities. A proposal right now that is getting some traction in the UK is using air. So you can store energy by liquefying air or compressing it, but liquefying it, you can actually store more in a smaller volume. And this is not that difficult to do. We do this and have been doing liquid air. You know, air liquefaction is probably what started the industrial gas age. So, you know, liquefying air was happening pre-1900. Wasn't great, but we could do it, and that's what kicked off companies like Air Products, Prax Air, and the other major ones, is their ability to liquefy air and separate it and produce usable industrial gases. So this is proven technology, and it's easy to build in various locations at various scales. This footprint scales for the storage of the liquid air itself, and what you do is just extract it from the air, turn it into a liquid, put it into your tank, and then when you want useful energy, you pull it out and add some heat, and you can add some heat using the environment because it's cold, and boost its pressure, and then you can drive and expand and make power. So interesting idea, and again, has some benefits in terms of the type of storage mode and in terms of environmental compatibility. But like all of these things, it comes down to a real value proposition, which gets to cost. And then we've got electrochemical systems, and the one we're all used to is storage batteries, right? Secondary batteries, charge, discharge, which are everywhere right now. And primarily the ones we hear the most about are the lithium-ion batteries. And so what I've got here is just a figure. And what's important here, when I'm going to show you some costs, and what's important when we see the costs are to understand what are being talked about. When it comes to batteries, the key is there's the, we talk about materials and the theoretical energy density of a material. You can then talk about an electrode. So you've actually made a component for a cell. The electrode will have a certain density of storage. You then use those electrodes to make a cell. That cell will have a certain storage density. And there's also costs that go with these. The cost of a cell will be a lot smaller than the cost of a pack or a module. So I can take cells and assemble them into a module. I can take a module and assemble them to a pack. So when costs are being quoted, you have to be really pay attention. What are they talking about? Is it the final pack? Is it the end use technology? Is it the module cell? Really important to pay attention to that, and that is not often clear. So unless you're really tracking things, you may see a number that is somewhat deceiving. This is also true for, I think Tom Tejiel's talk next week about solar. This is somewhat true with solar. Are they talking about a module? Are they like a single module that would go into a panel? Or are they talking about a panel? Or are they talking about a system? And those things can vary, and you'll see some amazing cost curves for solar modules that have gone way down. But when you look at a total cost, which includes, say, 5 or 6 other things, there comes a point when the module cost is somewhat irrelevant. Your costs are dominated by the other pieces, and those are the ones you need to start looking at, or you need to start paying attention to the assembly cost or the full system. So with a battery, this is the trick, is there's lots of various sort of scales at which you'll talk about batteries, and then there's the systems, and those systems employ a pack using some energy management components, power conditioning components. So there's a fair amount of stuff that goes in besides just the raw storage. Another type of battery, which you may have heard of, is a flow battery. And a flow battery is kind of like the daughter of a fuel cell and a secondary battery. It's got characteristics of both. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time, but fuel cell essentially has a power stack that you feed in your energy carriers and you get electricity out. That's what the center would be. This is just a single cell, and you can generate electricity through the electrochemical reaction with these 2 half cells. But with a flow battery, that energy storage mode is actually in the electrolyte you pump through. And so you have these external tanks that would store the electrolyte and store the energy. Unlike a fuel cell, which would have, say, a gas or something, and unlike a battery where the energy and the energy is encased within the electrode structure within the battery itself. And on what you see on the right side is, the sense of scale. This is a standard shipping container size, and the proposed flow battery that would go with this is roughly sort of the 500 kilowatt power and 2 kilowatt hours. Okay, so that's you can imagine a truck dropping this off somewhere, and then you could plug into it and you'd have a storage system which you could charge and discharge. So that's a kind of a survey of a select number of technologies. There's a lot going on in this figure that I'm talking to right now. What I'm trying to show you is various ways to store energy. Top is liquid hydrogen, hydrogen compressed to 1500 atmospheres. And then you see more hydrogen at various pressures. Methane compressed, liquid methane, right, or liquid natural gas, gasoline, ethanol, methanol, flywheel, nickel metal hydride batteries, lead acid batteries, liquid air, compressed air, elevated water. Okay, so these are various physical modes that I've just kind of reviewed. And what we see are 2 really important characteristics. The energy density in terms of kilowatt hours per unit mass, and the energy density per unit volume. And there's a blue bar and a purple bar, and there's some slight differences there to talk about delivered energy versus stored, because there's some efficiencies. and it's not important to focus on the numbers. What's important is to just look at the ranges, and you can see again why hydrogen has this compelling aspect to it, or gasoline, and why gasoline is just such an incredible energy vector. The volumetric energy storage density is really high. And so you think about anything that where volume and mass is important. It's got a pretty good mass too. The only thing that really can get close are methane and hydrogen, but those, you know, the tank systems are much more complex to store that at high pressures. So gasoline, or that liquid hydrocarbon that's around gasoline, the mass density and volumetric density are really, really high. And that's what makes some things possible, particularly certain transport modes. So when you think about trying to electrify some things like transport that uses this type of fuel storage, where are our options? And down below are some of the batteries. Lithium ion wasn't in this. When I grabbed this information, lithium ion wasn't there. So I've just added lithium ion. And lithium ion, I think I've got to hit this one more time. Today, it's right around 0.1 to 0.3 kilowatt hours per kilogram versus, well, you can look up the side, right? This is down here. You can barely see that kind of magnitude, 0.1. And then the volumetric is about 0.4 to 0.6. So, you know, we're in here. So those batteries are really amazing, and there's been a lot of really great developments, but you know, the density right now is still quite far from competing with gasoline, and it may not matter. So that's not relevant for some things, but it certainly is when we start to talk about, you know, jet transport. I'm going to pause 1 second because I'm just going to stop this and restart it because I noticed a little bit of lag, and I'm wondering if that's connected to the audio. So just hold on a second. And
Andrew, I think the audio has corrected itself. We haven't had a static problem for a little while.
Oh, now you tell me. Okay, I'm just going to close the other thing I've got open to see if that's part of the problem. It looks like it is. My computer is definitely getting very laggy. Okay, I'm going to come back now. Okay, so and just to help again with some of that context, I've got one more figure that's basically the same. It's just in slightly different units, and it has lithium-ion batteries on it. So lithium-ion in terms of gravimetric and volumetric is way down here in the corner. And so it's a great technology, but when we start to think about electrification and where we might use, you know, a pure battery that's like lithium-ion, we need to start to pay careful attention to what the demands are really like. And I know we had a lot of talk here a couple of years ago from Harbour Air about electric flight. And there's certain places where that certainly seems feasible. But when you start to talk about the Vancouver to Toronto run carrying 130 passengers, it's not going to happen on this battery. And even at the material limit, so what I've shown on the left here, it's the material limit. It's hard to imagine flying airplanes like that. So we really do need to think about how does electrification work, and maybe it's the indirect electrification path where we have to synthetically make fuels. And but this is sort of that, I talked about a supply curve for electricity. We really have a decarbonization curve, which we could order in terms of cost, and we do all the easy things first before we start getting into the really hard things. Okay, I'm going to start to wrap up here. I know this is a lot of information, but it's really important to talk about cost a little bit and the idea of value. And these are tricky. And right now, storage looks like it could offer a lot of value. And the trick is, can the value justify the expense? And what we're hearing about these days is trying to use what's called value stacking, multiple use cases as a way to pay for the installation. It means you need to find ways to get money and get paid for service in multiple ways, and it can be done. And so where can it be done? Going back to that figure that shows the grid and its requirements, the vertical axis is discharge duration and the bottom axis is number of cycles. This is really a map or a template that lays out the various places where storage, discharge duration and cycles is really about storage, and the types of services that could be served in the grid. And you can see bill management, transmission and distribution deferral, power quality. So, you know, where do you want to try and put storage, for what reason? And then you need to look at what that means. So what that means is what will be the operational profile I'm looking for from a storage system. So going back to, so I've got now essentially somewhat of a demand, you can think about it. The grid service we're trying to get at is that map. Here's a picture of the various technologies we might be considering to get in there. And this is a fairly recent collection of essentially learning curves showing different storage technology costs as a function of experience. So learning, basically any sort of technology that you build lots of, you learn and get better at doing it, you reduce the costs. And in this case, we see storage. So the learning is shown by the cumulative installed capacity in terms of gigawatt hours energy. And then the vertical axis is the price. Okay, so, and this is in dollars per kilowatt hour of storage capacity. And we've got a number of different technologies, and I wanted to highlight again, the symbol shape is important because it reflects, is it the system, the pack, the module, or the cell itself? Okay, so let's go down this and just pick a couple. There's pumped hydro. So pumped hydro's been around a long time. It's generally a fairly large storage technology when it's built. So we get out to the vertical, far out to the right of the axis pretty quickly. And you can see pumped hydro is actually, what this curve suggests, there's not a lot of data points, but it says this technology is mature. We're not seeing that downward slope. But basically, there's not a lot of room left to improve it. So mature technologies, here's another one. What do we have here? This is lead acid battery. And again, lead acid battery, we've been building those for a very long time and building lots of them. And you see, it's, you know, it's got its up and downs due to commodity price changes over time, but it's fairly flat. So that suggests that that's a fairly mature technology. Then we see some of these really, fast decreasing lines. So this is lithium ion and electronics. This would be sort of the battery that would go into a computer or a cell phone. And then we've got electric vehicles, which is right here, the blue boxes, and you can see years. So this is helping to track where roughly in time we are versus this installed capacity. So some really incredibly fast price decreases. And when you see a steep line like this, and it's a logarithmic scale, that tells you it was really going down fast. Okay, so this is what makes sort of predicting the future so hard, is you need to take into account changing prices, but of course things eventually start to become mature technologies and that they don't have this continued downward trajectory. And when is that going to happen and why? And that's tricky to figure out. And those who can figure that out are usually the ones who invest very wisely. They're ahead of the curve on a lot of, as compared to a lot of other people. So if I've got a cost, what does that mean for value? And what I want to try and get at is, so levelized cost of energy for electricity supplies, the analogous number is levelized cost of storage. What is the all-in cost to provide storage per something? What do I levelize it by? The amount of energy delivered, or by the amount of power I've got available from it? Well, there's a lot that goes into figuring that out. And what I just showed you is basically just the purchase price. That collection of learning curves is really just what I could buy either a pack, a module, or a system for. So that might be right here in terms of the overnight cost. So that's one piece of a number that goes into determining the actual levelized cost of service, right? I pay either per unit power rating or per unit energy rating. If I want to know what I actually get in terms of cost per energy delivered, that's not the same as storage. But again, you'll never know that when you see numbers because they just say kilowatt hours. You don't know if it's, what are they talking about? Or power, is it again the power rating of the battery or electrochemical device? Or is it the power that actually is available to the grid? And then there's also ancillary services, which we don't have time to talk about. What goes into determining this are some techno-economic parameters. So the rated power of the system, rated energy, depth of discharge, number of cycles per year, and every technology has some sort of degradation. So how fast does it degrade, and what's the efficiency? And those things will vary as a function of cycles and depth of discharge. So this gets really complicated. Virgin batteries will not look the same after a year or 2 years, and they can be very different depending upon who's been using them and how they've been managing the state of charge. So this gets much more complicated when you actually try to get into looking at the grid and understanding how you might present a business case to the grid. But what we see here is essentially a picture of how the consultant group Lazard would go at this. And they do this now on an annual basis. They put out a report saying what's the state of the storage technology world and where do we see value, and what we see happening is looking at different sectors and looking how a technology might value stack. It can get in and get paid for certain types of services, and not just one, hopefully a lot, so that it can recover costs. So that's all getting complicated. Let's back up and make it simple. And I'm going to back up and make it simple by going all the way back to California and a house in California that has solar. This is something that you're going to talk about or learn about next week. And this is a lot of what's happened. When I showed you California's net load and the solar, there's a lot of residential storage that's been installed. And this is a typical California house. It has 6 kilowatts or a little more than 6 kilowatts of PV installed. And you can see what the impact is for this home in winter, spring, summer, and fall. We see one typical day where there's demand in black, and we see the installed solar kicking in the middle of the day, the big yellow, and it pushes down the demand you need from the grid, right? This is all self-supply from solar. And if we have excess PV output, what's happening to it? And that, again, it might be going to the grid, it might not be, and maybe it is, but I'm not getting any value for that. It'll depend upon the jurisdiction and what they've got set up. Well, let's take it one step further now, because I'm a homeowner with this PV. I've decided I'm not getting good value from my excess. Why don't I store it up and shave off some of this expensive evening demand I still have? I'm going to buy a storage system. So I install my storage system at my house, and this little diagram is meant to represent now the sort of technological chain that's happening. Local generation using PV, local demand, storage, and maybe some other generation that's going in there to serve it. And you know, for a house, typically you don't have anything else. Here's that same house now with a 4 kilowatt hour battery installed. And so you can see where we have some excess generation, we can charge up a battery. And then later on, when I have this, you see the dashed line is my net. When the sun goes away, demand is coming on strong in the house because we've all come home. I can make use of that using my battery. So this is a, you know, this is a great outcome of the huge improvements in PV and storage that have happened over the last 10 years. And this is going to help us a lot. What's tricky, though, is still trying to understand who it helps the most and where it's the preferred choice. Because typically you don't buy something because it's the only thing. Usually you have a choice. And you may decide, why buy the PV and battery? Why don't I just buy my electricity from the grid, right? That's what typically would happen. And so this is tricky because obviously there's maybe some carbon angle that we want to go after, but people have a finite amount of money, and so they typically want to spend it wisely. Here's again, this is a bit of a busy figure. I'll try and walk through it, but this is an analysis saying, let's look at somebody who does this for residential storage to go with PV. And what they've done is they've said, let's take into account the fact that we're learning fast on these technologies and costs are dropping quickly. What does it look like when we look to the future for this combination of PV? This is done for Germany. So Germany's a very particular location, and may not, the results you see here will not reflect us. And why will it not reflect us? Perhaps the system cost curve, the blue projection as a function of year, maybe we have access to that. What's different though, and this is where the value part comes in, is what they pay typically in Germany to buy electricity service from the utility. And that's the red line. And what you see on here, and you know, let's do some unit conversions. Our bill payment right now in BC, 10 to 12 cents a kilowatt hour. What you see here is Germany, and they're 38, 35, and going forward, It's a little bit of a climb. So quite a bit more to buy that service from the grid. And what the figure is showing is based on learning rates and cost reductions in Germany, where that is your alternative choice. It looks like somewhere out here in 2030, 2035, the economic choice is very clear. You just buy storage and you buy PV, because that is the economic, you will benefit economically. And that's going to be a little different, again, depending on what the expected learning is. So that's why we see these bands here. There's a lot of uncertainty, and it'll also change depending on where you are and what you think retail power price will do. And as I said in part one, the forces at work here tend to be driving energy prices down because we're getting all this low cost renewables. So this red line is another sort of moving target depending where you are. One more analysis does the same thing, thinking about electric vehicles. And again, they're comparing a battery electric to an IC engine. And it's the same idea. I'm trying to understand, based on the learning rates around the EV battery technology and EV costs, where do we get parity? And this looks pretty good, right? This is comparing just pure fuel tank and gasoline against battery and electricity, a battery pack and the electricity purchase price only. And I mean, the error bars on this show we're pretty well at parity for this particular location. And that, you know, this can be done for anywhere, and you'll get slightly different, or maybe not slightly, maybe a lot different outcomes. I'm just about done, and then we have a bit of time for questions. My last slide here, it goes back to this map of the grid, basically frequency, discharge duration. So we had a map of all the different types of value that the grid could get, which was reflecting this type of plot. What I'm showing is a result here from a fairly recent paper where they went in and probed essentially all these different storage technologies, looked at the learning rates, looked at the operational profile, what are the efficiencies, degradation, tried to pull this all together and identify what technology fit where. So the year is 2020, and what we see are a selection of storage technologies: pumped hydro, compressed air, lithium ion, vanadium flow battery, flywheel, and hydrogen. Okay, so the colors are the technology. In 2020, when you look at the storage domain where storage could be used on the grid, the colors show, essentially based on cost information and operational profile and all that other stuff, the best technology choice. So down here in red, the best technology choice would be lithium-ion battery. As we look at longer durations, we move up, we get into blue, pumped hydro, we get into green, compressed air. Way up at the top, you see a little gray, and that would be hydrogen. Moving to really high frequencies, you get into flow batteries, you get into flywheel for really high frequency storage. So there's a place for all these different technologies to try and compete, and they'll survive if they can compete. Question is, can they? So now this study was great because they did the projection forward. And so now we'll look at 2030 and 2040. And based upon current trajectories for these costs and performance numbers, the map changes. As we move forward in time, lithium-ion batteries take over more of the space, and eventually even more. Pushed out, well, we see purple disappear. What's interesting is we see this black grow. This is hydrogen up in the long-term seasonal storage type application. This has gone from just a little bit of gray to the dominant storage mode up in that area of operation. And then we still have a little bit of compressed air. We still have some pumped hydro. There was one other plot they produced where they actually pulled out pumped hydro and compressed air, because these have geographic limitations. You need to have the right geography and space to do it. Whereas lithium ion, vanadium, flywheel, and hydrogen, you can imagine putting those almost anywhere. They're very modular in terms of spatial deployment. And when you do that, you get a new map that essentially pushes hydrogen in even further. And then, of course, lithium ion takes over a bit more. So really interesting times and interesting place to be operating if you're into storage and electrification, energy systems. I find it fascinating. And I am going to just wrap this up, and hopefully we've got time for a little bit of discussion. That was a huge amount of information. Like I said, last night I was feeling good about